For more than 150 years, Mayo Clinic has been recognized as the worldwide leader in healthcare, known for providing premier patient care, medical education, and research. With 3 campuses and one vision to transform healthcare, Mayo Clinic offers a truly unique environment. We remain strongly positioned to further accelerate healthcare delivery while staying true to our primary value: the needs of the patient comes first. We look forward to a continual relationship with NACI, strengthening our collective voices and the healthcare profession. Have a great conference.
Hello, my name is Brandon Batiste, one of the NACI Education co-chairs. Our moderator for this session, Leading Through Crisis, Management Perspectives from the Frontline, is Brittany Williams. Brittany Williams is the Operations Administrator for the Division of Hematology and Medical Oncology at the Mayo Clinic in Arizona and holds the academic rank of instructor in the Mayo College of Medicine and Science. Her challenging role as a leader in the Division of Hematology and Medical Oncology allows her to fulfill her professional mission to provide quality care and create a positive experience for all patients. She also serves as the site director for the Administrative Fellowship Program and the site liaison for the Mayo Clinic Response to Racism. Brittany honed her healthcare administration knowledge as an administrative fellow with the Mayo Clinic starting in July of 2012. She also served as a fellow for 2 years prior to accepting a position as an operations manager for the Department of Neurology in Arizona. As a manager for the Department of Neurology, she supported a team of dedicated healthcare professionals in a challenging environment as they provide world-class care. Brittany earned a Master's of Health Administration degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and earned a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from the University of Florida. Her professional memberships include the American College of Healthcare Executives, the National Association of Health Services Executives, and the Healthcare Financial Management Association. She serves on the leadership committee for the Coalition of Blacks Against Breast Cancer. She's an Elevate Med Advisory Board member and a Ronald McDonald House Charities of Central and Northern Arizona board member and a member of the Links Incorporated. A Sigma Black Belt, Brittany is co-developer and instructor for the Six Sigma Green Belt course at Arizona State University and the College of Health Solutions. She enjoys educating high school students about personal finance and provides seminars about budgeting and debt management. Ladies and gentlemen, Brittany Williams.
Hello, NACI members. We are excited to bring you this panel today. I think you'll all find that the information we're going to learn from our esteemed panelists is very pertinent to what a lot of us are dealing with within our healthcare systems and also the ancillary environments that some of us may work in. Without further ado, I'll take this opportunity to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Kendall Thomas. As the Director of Hospital Medicine at Ochsner Jefferson Highway, Kendall is responsible for driving the operational, financial, and strategic performance of the health system's flagship medical center's hospital medicine department. After graduating with his bachelor's degree from Morehouse College, Kendall went on to earn a Master of Public Health degree with a focus in health policy and systems management from Louisiana State University Health Sciences Center in New Orleans. Following his graduate program, Kendall completed an administrative fellowship at Vidant Medical Center in Greenville, North Carolina. Post-fellowship, Kendall returned to Louisiana, where he joined the Ochsner Medical Center Keener leadership team, supporting a number of multi-specialty ambulatory clinics, 2 chemotherapy infusion centers, and the regional call center. In his downtime, Kendall enjoys traveling with his wife, Jessie, cooking, freelance street photography, and biking. Mr. Kendall Thomas.
20 months ago, on Tuesday, February the 25th, I woke up with a dilemma on my mind. I turned to my wife and I asked a very simple question. Is it really worth waking up this early to go to yet another parade? Now, I know you may be wondering, how on earth is deciding to go to a parade a dilemma let alone a means to a crisis. Well, for those of you who are familiar with Louisiana culture and traditions, you know that this is a 3-week process by which we overindulge in eating king cake, going to festivals, attending balls and parades. None other more important than the Zulu Parade put on by the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club, which is among the city's oldest continuously operating social aid and pleasure clubs in the city. So, next slide. What do? We ride our bikes the 5 or 6 miles down to St. Charles and Jackson Avenue, where we're met with a host of friends and family, where we eat, drink, tell stories, and laugh. And not to mention work for the oh-so-coveted prize of a hand-painted Zulu coconut. Unbeknownst to us, these would be ingredients to a recipe of disaster that we would not fully recognize until much later. Fast forward 2 weeks. Wednesday, March 11th, I'm sitting in a meeting with our physician chairs and hospital executives, talking through how we might respond to the pandemic that is now spreading wide in New York and Seattle. I get a phone call in the meeting, so I step out, and it's our nocturnist. He calls me to inform that we have just admitted our first patient that we suspect and later confirmed to have COVID. Fast forward 4 days. Next slide. I get the following email from one of our cardiologists, which is a message that the first is broken into 2 parts. It's a message that he has sent to a colleague in Italy, and the second part is his warning to us. I'm hearing of let's see, I'm so sorry, it's a little bit, excuse me, it's a little bit choppy. Give me 1 second. Excuse me. All right. Please excuse me here. So the message to the cardiologist in Italy: I'm hearing of a dire situation in other countries where the virus is spread unchecked. In an effort to provide calm, I'm reaching out to you as someone that I know as a straight shooter to allay my fears. And his response to us: quite the opposite has happened, I'm afraid to say. The situation in his town, hospital in northern Italy is horrible. Half of the physicians are sick or carriers of the virus. Patients are presenting with a cough, dying of pneumonia 8 hours later. The hospital resources are consumed by virus patients. There are no elective procedures being done. The whole city is locked down and everyone is fearing for their lives and the lives of their loved ones. I'm writing you first. I will contact my family next. Please, because I love you and I care for you and I want you to hear what's happening because the pandemic will be here very soon. Please take care of yourself and your families and treat this threat seriously. This is more serious to me than Katrina. So, as the director of the city's largest hospital medicine department, what do you do next? Do you alert your family? Do you work on a strategic plan for the department? These were all questions that I was asking myself. So the first thing that I did naturally was think through what other circumstances have leaders led through uncertain and very volatile times. So naturally, my mind went to Katrina and General Russell Honore leading the city through its post-hurricane results. Next, I reached out to mentors in other cities that had not yet been affected by the pandemic, and I asked them a very simple question. What do I do next? Next slide. And the consensus was very consistent. They said indecision is a decision. And so I knew I needed to act. So I met with my physician counterpart. We call them dyads here at Ochsner, and we put together a plan. And the first course of action on that plan was to listen. Listen to the conversation that was happening globally, listen to that conversation that was happening in Italy and New York so that we could learn from those lessons. And lastly, and most importantly, listen to our team. And so we would later coin the strategy that we used as the 4 S's. How are we on space? Do we have enough staffing to meet the crisis? What concerns do you have around supplies? And lastly, most importantly, how are you personally? How are you managing yourself? And what can we do to support? So naturally, the conversation around space: do we have enough physical beds to take care of these COVID patients? Secondly, do we have enough staff should the volume increase beyond our own capacity? Thirdly, do we have enough supplies to make sure that you can safely go in and care for the patients? And we made a very clear decision. We told our physicians, if you do not feel comfortable and confident that you have what you need to go into that room, do not go into the room. And that was the moment that I realized the difference between leadership and managing a crisis. Next slide. So as a part of the conversation that we had with our physicians, and perhaps the most important aspect of the 4S's was self, we learned that there were a few physicians that had underlying medical conditions that made them a little bit apprehensive to caring for those patients. And that was no problem at all for us, because our true north and our compass has always been the equity and the health of our team members. So what do? We leveraged a service offering that we have used primarily in our critical access hospitals, which was virtual hospital medicine. We set up criteria for patients who would be most appropriate for this. Examples of this would be COVID patients that were on room air or declining off of their oxygen requirements, or patients that were non-COVID that were medically stable and clinically otherwise ready to go home, but had some type of social issues or accepting facility challenges. And so you would think after multiple waves of the pandemic, we had everything set, we were using this blueprint, everything is going well. Well, not so much. This is between July and November of hurricane season. So next slide. We had the busiest hurricane season on record. There were 31 named storms, 19 of which made landfall on the United States shore, and the majority of those being in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. And if you look at the top right slide, there was a time in which there were actually 2 storms barreling down on Southeast Louisiana at once. So again, I asked myself in these situations, how do you respond? What do you do next? And we went back to our 4S strategy. Do we have enough space to house our physicians? Should we need to require them to remain on campus? Do we have the staffing should there be a COVID spike, given that this was not a mandatory evacuation for the city? Do you have the supplies, the food, the sustenance you need to make sure that you have enough rest, prepared to see patients every day? And lastly, what concerns do you have? Is your family able to evacuate so that we could alleviate any concerns that our providers had? And so I'll leave you with this last slide. So this was a poem written by June Jordan, who is an activist from New York, in response to the 1958 protest in regards to the past laws in South Africa, apartheid. She ended with, "We are the ones that we've been waiting for." So all the questions that I presented to you today were questions that were spiraling through my mind consistently throughout the pandemic. And it really took a moment for me to take a step back and realize that there was no parent, there was no executive that would be able to swoop in and give all of the answers. And I knew that when I looked internally that I had what it took to be a leader that could get our team through this. And so I would challenge you with the same. We are the ones that we have been waiting for. Don't look for others to find the solutions. Get in, listen to your team, and be a leader. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kendall. That framework, I definitely was taking notes, the 4S's. Those of us who are familiar with process improvement probably are very familiar with the 5S's. So I think we can definitely put that in our back pockets and pull it out today probably, because I know a lot of us are still in the midst of pandemic activities. And unfortunately, we are seeing spikes throughout our country with the ebbs and flows. I would like to take this opportunity to open up the Q&A to make sure that you all know at the bottom of your screens, there's a Q&A opportunity. If you have questions that you would like for me to ask Kendall or any of the other panelists at the end of our session, please don't hesitate to put those questions in the Q&A forum. Additionally, those of us who have been to NACI in person know that one of the richest elements of NACI is our ability to connect with one another. And so you can use the chat function to connect with your fellow colleagues or others who maybe you haven't seen in a while, or just say hello to someone new and start the dialogue there. So I encourage you, use the Q&A, use the chat function. Our next esteemed panelist is Ms. Hillary Davis. Hillary Davis joined Ochsner Health in November 2020 as a regional director of diversity and inclusion. Her dedication to diversity, equity, and belonging comes complemented with expertise in many areas of state and federal legislative and government affairs. Hillary's experience includes policy analysis, external relations, stakeholder engagement, and regulatory compliance. Hillary previously served under former New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landry in the Office of Workforce Development, managing federal workforce development grants and developing career pathway strategies for incumbent workers. She is also a 2018 Women's Congressional Policy Institute Fellow, where she completed a congressional fellowship on the House Majority Committee on Homeland Security. Prior to joining Ochsner Health, Hillary worked in state government relations in Northrop Grumman Corporation, where her portfolio included monitoring D&I legislation compliance and developing partnership opportunities for underrepresented suppliers in key states. After joining Ochsner Health, Hillary quickly became an integral partner in developing a regional DEI strategy and serving as senior advisor to leadership. Hillary is a native of Tampa, Florida, and holds a BS in political science from Fisk University and a Master of Public Health Administration from Southern University and A&M College, Baton Rouge. Without further ado, Ms. Hillary Davis.
Thank you, Brittany. Natural disasters compounded with the devastation of COVID-19 created what I've coined a herdemic. Frontline communities often bear the brunts of impacts that are actually caused by these disasters. And in times of crisis, we typically ask ourselves, is now really the right time to focus on health equity? Even though we know that equitable systems really do help everyone, not just those that are certainly most vulnerable. But I would challenge you to think, what if we reimagined our approach by not choosing to prioritize social, race, and health issues, but instead creating an ecosystem where we actually leverage the full strengths of diverse talents, experiences, and partnerships to create a more equitable Louisiana. Well, here at Ochsner Health, we are actually building that system, and we're doing it through what we call transformational inclusion. I bet you're like, what in the world is transformational inclusion? So we've conducted over 250 listening sessions with underrepresented employees across the state. And this helped us to also launch DEI advisory boards at a system and local level to really help us to identify what are those blind spots, where are our opportunities, and where are we having success through the perspectives of unique voices and also disciplines. The qualitative and the quantitative data that we collected from this process really suggested that a collaborative approach was actually the way to balance health equity and the herdemics that I talked about a little earlier to really help us to achieve those better health outcomes. It also included developing innovative healthcare delivery models, like launching over 37 neighborhood healthcare centers across the state. And this is really to help us to decrease those interruptions to care and deliver that accessible, culturally competent care that we need as underrepresented groups. This model also included forging strong partnerships with local HBCUs that currently, of course, I have a bias as a double HBCU grad, but of course, like the creation of our partnership with Xavier University, which we created the Ochsner and Xavier Institute for Health Equity and Research. This also helped us to prioritize economic inclusion, and this was really expanding our supplier diversity program that provides those resources and support to help disadvantaged businesses to compete for those projects that we currently have. And lastly, for building a very strong cross-regional DEI strategy that expanded across the state of Louisiana. And so how did we actually arrive at why all of this was even mission critical? Well, did you know that it takes frontline communities much longer to recover from a disaster? Research actually shows that Black and Hispanic households often lose an average of $27,000 and $29,000 in wealth, respectively, after a disaster, while white households tend to gain about $126,000. Since health and wealth, of course, are connected, this means that members of frontline communities are often at a higher risk to become sicker than their counterparts after a disaster. So we had to prioritize. Through that partnership with Xavier University, we were able to focus on recruiting a diverse workforce by including healthcare equity education in our professional training programs. And also our cross-regional DEI strategy really placed diversity directors in 6 key regions across the state to help us serve as advisors to our executive leadership team at the hospital campuses that we serve. And this was really to help drive those system initiatives at a local level to make sure that we are measuring and monitoring success. And of course, as diversity directors, we were able to really implement a very strong engagement strategy. And this included building interactive workshops that were really geared towards helping leaders to understand why we have to keep D&I efforts at the top of mind, although we're dealing with the hurricane. And of course, in this time, we were able to launch those regional diversity advisory boards. And this was really done by, this was created by using demographic data to help us to ensure that representation reflected the patients that we serve and the communities where we live. This cross-regional approach really allowed us to expand our employee resource groups. And this helped us to really solve some strong business challenges that we had, while also helping our employees to build community and raising their cultural awareness. Our community health clinics helped us to really connect to those outreach partners that we were able to deliver vaccines to our most vulnerable citizens. And of course, all of these initiatives helped us to shape our transformational inclusion approach to decrease interruptions to care, but also deliver that culturally competent care. And so this framework really helps us to give gives us a unique opportunity to notice, but also understand health equity and inclusion more deeply. It also helps us to listen and communicate more clearly and to make those really strong decisions with a broader input in mind. And of course, it helps us to be more vulnerable, as we know that daring leadership requires that we are vulnerable with one another. Through transformational inclusion, we really empower ourselves to shift towards a healthier reality where we ultimately grow and we thrive in seemingly impossible circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hillary. It's fascinating to hear what Oshner did at the intersection of a pandemic and also a cultural shift, I hope, in our environment. So really grateful for you for teaching us about transformational inclusion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brittany.
Our next panelist is Mr. Christopher Cunney. Christopher Cunney serves as Chief Strategist in Business Development for DSS Inc.'s Juno EHR product line. Before joining DSS Inc. Incorporated, Mr. Cunney served as Senior Vice President of Healthcare Information Technology for Coker Group and Managing Partner and IT Strategist of IoTech Consulting. He also served as entrepreneur in residence at the Combine, Director of Emerging Healthcare Technology for AT&T, Vice President and COO for Health Innovations, and Vice President and CIO for Piedmont Healthcare. Mr. Cunney has a track record of developing and implementing strategic enterprise-wide solutions that address the current issues faced by health systems, including governance, meaning use, PPACA, HITECH Act, HIPAA, EMR adoption, CMS quality measures, and HIEs. Mr. Cunney has served as instructor at large for the Emory University Healthcare IT Certification Program and is an industry advisor to the Minority Business Development Agency Business Center, Atlanta, and the Georgia Institute of Technology's HIT Cluster Program, ITT Technical Institute, Georgia State University, and DeVry University, Atlanta. He also serves as the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce HIT Public Policy and Bioscience Task Force and Health IT Leadership Council. He has appeared as a subject matter expert at numerous healthcare IT industry conferences and events in a variety of publications, including the Atlanta Business Chronicle, Modern Healthcare, Who's Who in Business and Industry, and Who's Who in Black Atlanta. He was also featured in the spring 2006 article, Minorities in Healthcare, published by the Atlanta Hospital News. He co-authors various articles, white papers, and presents nationally on topics surrounding the impact of health information technology on the clinical ecosystem. Christopher was most recently identified by Healthcare Information Management Systems Society as a 2019-2020 industry changemaker. Mr. Cunney shares his perspective on life, leadership, and business through social media outlets, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Google+. With that, Mr. Christopher Cunney.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be a part of this panel discussion. As was stated, my background is primarily in the technology space, so I will provide a little bit of a technology perspective around managing crisis, as well as providing what I believe is an overall perspective around just managing through challenging situations. You know, when leading through crisis as a leader, most leaders are really forced to think and behave in ways that feel unfamiliar to themselves, whether it's a technology issue or a financial issue or a natural disaster or a health crisis at work or within the community. You know, crisis really demands that leaders take and develop and implement emergency response plans and adapt them to the evidence that they gather as the situation starts to develop. All the while, when managing through the crisis, leaders have to remain calm, create and maintain a sense of perspective, and try to reduce the anxiety and challenges that employees and staff may be experiencing as the crisis is taking place. Today, I'll talk about, in general, how technology leaders are managing crisis, and then how leaders overall are managing crisis, and offer kind of a 5-step approach to that as well. Next slide. You know, interesting, the COVID pandemic was what I call the perfect storm. When you think about the traditional healthcare system, healthcare systems are really relied on well-established disease management pathways and evidence-based care approaches to really manage the care and demands of the delivery of care, and using those standardized practices to improve quality. You know, those systems were under immense pressure due to the massive amount of infections that occurred within the communities and the impact it had on the delivery model. COVID-19 really drove and forced organizations to start thinking more innovatively and to start managing this crisis in a multitude of ways. Not only with, in general, with resources and staff, with supply chains, but also how do we now start to reimagine how we provide care and deliver and manage our businesses in the midst of a pandemic. You know, those natural shortages of PPE equipment and ventilators and treatment protocols and long hours that clinicians had to deal and still are dealing with in managing crisis. This crisis situation has put a lot of pressure on the system. And so today we'll talk a little bit about how technology has had an impact on that, but more importantly, what are some of the steps that can be taken to help manage organizations through those crises. Next slide. So from a technology standpoint, CIOs were forced to really rethink the way that they delivered businesses. You know, update their electronic health record systems to support things like surveillance monitoring and workflows related to COVID infected patients, scaling to virtual care programs and work from home strategies, moving towards telemedicine as a mainstay of delivering primary care to patients, coming up with new ways of collaborating and interfacing with their colleagues, and dealing with the ongoing cybersecurity risks that are associated with that as well. Next slide. So, you know, that being said, what are some practical steps, you know, that not only IT leaders, but business leaders can embark on when managing through a crisis? And I have what I call a 5-step approach to that. Step 1 being seek credible information. You know, as an IT leader, you know, or leader in general, it's your responsibility to determine what the most reliable and up-to-date information is and what the most trustworthy information is to relay back to your employees and staff. Avoiding getting information from social media platforms that have a political and financial and activist agenda is extremely important when disseminating accurate, complete, and unbiased information about a situation, and making sure that you're consulting with experts that can provide that information from an unbiased perspective is key. Next slide. No, using really appropriate communication channels. How do we communicate? Face-to-face or through virtual channels? You know, there's a plethora of tools that are out there today that help you do that. But most importantly, it's important that we do communicate. Key information should be handled in what I call the 3 R's: review, repeat, and reinforce. Review, repeat, and reinforce. It's important to remember that when you're having to communicate to staff, you want to make sure that that information is accurate, complete, and you communicate it in a consistent and repeatable way. Lack of knowledge then will lead to what I call MSU, making stuff up. And invariably, making stuff up will lead to creating the scenarios that are even more worse than the pandemic or the situation in and of itself, no matter how bad the reality really is. So it's really important for us to make sure that that information is accurate, complete, and consistently delivered to our staff on an ongoing basis. Next slide. Explain what your organization is doing to combat the crisis. It's not just about talking about the problem in and of itself, but what are we going to do to solve it or to address it? Even if we don't have all the information that's necessary to understand the full breadth of the crisis as it exists today. What are we going to do at that particular point? As new information then presents itself, you provide updates to your staff and to the community as to how your organization is going to handle that. As the situation changes, you go back to those 3 R's. And you continue to repeat that information, and you provide regular information that provides the latest and greatest insights on what's happening. Next slide. Be present and visible at all times. During a crisis, leaders should be accessible, visible, whether it's virtually or in person, because it's not always possible to walk around in a hospital in a clinical setting or business setting and talk to colleagues and staff. It's still important to find vehicles and ways to remain visible, having regular communication sessions, town hall meetings. If you can walk around meeting with the staff and doing that in a consistent way is equally as important. When the staff sees the leadership is engaged, involved, and on the front lines with them, it gives them a sense of security and gives them a sense that the leadership is in this crisis with us, and we're willing to now go the extra mile as well. Next slide. After going through a crisis, or like any crisis that takes place, you go through those peaks and valleys that occur. There will be situations where the crisis will start to subside, the curve will start to flatten, and we'll have time to start thinking about and doing a postmortem and start thinking about how do we deal with that crisis, how do we deal with that situation, and making adjustments, and also to start thinking more proactively. Now that we have experienced a pandemic, what are we going to do the next time a pandemic happens? How are we going to manage this situation differently than we've dealt with it before, so that we don't make the same mistakes or the same errors, or we can get through that crisis in a much more effective way? It's important to look back on what happened, to assess it, to do a postmortem, and then to start putting in place, wherever it makes sense, proactive activities, resources that make us better prepared when the next situation occurs. Next slide. I did want to touch on because I am a technologist, I have to touch on how technology really led to helping to manage things within the crisis itself, the pandemic itself. There's an old saying, necessity breeds innovation. Around the world, COVID-19 has forced organizations to entirely reassess how they do business and deliver care. Technology was at the forefront of laying the foundation of our ability to do that. And today, we're now not only leveraging that technology as a foundational component, but we're also now using it as the way we do business on an ongoing basis today. Next slide. It's important, and Gartner offers kind of a framework around it. I'm sure these slides will be available. I won't go through it in great detail, but I'll just point out some key components of it. It's important, as you're going through this crisis and you're starting to look at technology as a component to help you remediate or manage it, is to evangelize the value of innovation. We don't want to keep thinking about things the same way we used to do, and whether it's processes, technologies, or people. Innovation is a core part of how we manage change. Determining a better way to meet a customer or a patient's needs through the use of these technologies or process changes is something we need to look at. We need to also look at short-term and long-term opportunities by realigning our innovations and portfolios to meet our long-term strategies. And we need to stay resilient by, continuing to test things that make sense at the time it's happening. But if they don't yield the results we want, to quickly pivot and move in another direction as well. Understanding that this is an ongoing process. Next slide. Just real quickly, I just wanted to talk about, again, with the pandemic, we've recognized that healthcare organizations have now embraced technology as a core part of how we deliver care. It's now very much a digital first strategy. And how do we use things like virtual care, telemedicine, virtual patient monitoring, other tools to manage care? Next slide. We're putting the patient first within this process. And we're using a wide variety of protocols and tools to make that happen. Next slide. We're also embracing a wide variety of technologies, just like the one we're in today. I mean, this conference would normally be held in person. Now we're using things like Zoom and Slack and Flock and other Teams and other tools to help us continue to collaborate and to be able to do our business even in a remote environment. Next slide. And then we're also starting to adopt a model where we're leveraging other technology companies like Salesforce, Microsoft, and others to create technology that helps support clinical care. And then finally, these last couple of sections, there's a whole, next slide. Next slide. There's a whole host of technologies that are starting to emerge, and we don't have time to go through them in great detail. But again, artificial intelligence, disposable devices, 3D printing, contact tracing technologies are all starting to emerge in this space. And then the final couple slides. I just wanted to recommend a couple of books. Next slide. And I won't read them in detail. The slides will be available. But for those of you who are trying to understand best practices around managing crises, here's a couple of slides for books that I would recommend you consider reading. And then final slide. Crisis management is a really strategical approach to managing catastrophic situations and preparing an organization to manage those threats in the most effective way possible. It's important for us to think about not only how we respond to these things, but how do we make sure that we communicate accurate information to our leadership, to our staff, and to the community at large. Having a plan that's thought out proactively can help us to reduce some of the anxiety and issues that might occur in the organization when these things do occur. Next slide. Questions?
Thank you so much, Christopher. I think we all found ourselves appreciating our technologists so much more during this pandemic and appreciating their contribution to our ability to meet the needs of our patients. So thank you for that. And I'll be honest, I might have found myself MSU in a little bit, just a little bit, when the details maybe weren't as clear around the technology. They told me just power it off and turn it back on and all things shall work out. So thank you for that. Our last and final panelist is not here with us live, but asynchronously has provided information for us to digest. Mr. Kevin Sawyers, MSN, RN, FAAN, is president of the Johns Hopkins Health System and executive vice president of Johns Hopkins Medicine. As the second person in Johns Hopkins history to hold these dual roles, Mr. Sawyers oversees the health system's 6 hospitals: the Johns Hopkins Hospital, Johns Hopkins Bayview Medical Center, Howard County General Hospital, Suburban Hospital, Sibley Memorial Hospital, and Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital, and set strategies that advance our mission to deliver outstanding care, train the next generation of leaders, and advance research and discovery. He also serves as chair of the Johns Hopkins Community Physicians, which is more than 40 primary and specialty care outpatient sites throughout Maryland and the Washington, D.C. area. Mr. Sawyers came to Johns Hopkins Medicine after 32 years with the Duke University Health System, the last 8 as president and CEO of Duke University Hospital. He joined Duke University Medical Center Hospital in 1985 as a staff nurse in oncology and held several faculty and nursing leadership positions. His numerous senior leadership posts across Duke University Health System included Chief Operating Officer for Duke University Hospital and interim CEO for Durham Regional Hospital. Among his senior administrative roles, Mr. Sawyers oversaw consolidation of Duke's clinical lab services, emergency and trauma services, and managed care and patient care services. Sawyers earned his Bachelor of Science degree from Capital University School of Nursing and a Master of Science from Duke University School of Nursing. He is an American Academy of Nursing Fellow and has collaborated on numerous research efforts as well as cons- consulted internationally. He has published extensively and speaks nationally and abroad on issues such as leadership, organizational change, mentorship, and cancer care. Sawyers lives in Baltimore with his partner, Anthony Evans. Without further ado, we shall hear from Mr. Sawyers.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me here today to share my perspective on leading through crisis. I'm Kevin Sowers, President of Johns Hopkins Health System and Executive Vice President of Johns Hopkins Medicine. And as you well know, for the last 20 months, our world has faced many challenges, including a global pandemic, political divisions, ethnic, racial, and social injustices, and fallout from the economic realities tied to navigating all of these issues simultaneously. For those of you who have been a part of emergency management drills, you know how the person leading the drill starts with a scenario and then escalates the situation, layering on crisis on top of crisis to see how your team will respond. Well, now I think we can all better appreciate the reasoning behind those escalating disaster drill scenarios, because that has been our reality since the pandemic's start. And that's why developing our crisis leadership skills is more important now than perhaps ever before in modern history. So I'd like to share several lessons for leading through crisis that I have gleaned over my more than 35 years in healthcare. And one of my first lessons I learned in my career is that leaders must develop the ability to cultivate peace and calm while standing in the unknown and not get caught up in the chaos. The current global political and economic environments create a lot of uncertainty for all of us. But no matter if you're a leader developing responses to COVID-19 or leading transformational change within your organization, you need to learn to be calm amidst the chaos. And I am thankful to have learned that lesson early on in my career. My first job out of college was an oncology nurse at Duke University Hospital. And when I was a new grad, only 6 months out of nursing school, I became the charge nurse on evenings and nights. Now, I wouldn't recommend this as the norm, but the unit leadership had to. It was during the great nursing shortage across the U.S. that occurred back then, and they didn't have enough experienced nurses to take the charge role. I was in charge one of those evenings that if anything could go bad, it happened. I had a code on Team 1, and halfway through that code, a code was called on Team 2. I was running back and forth from side to side. And as the evening started to calm down, there was a patient's husband who had been in the hall watching me run back and forth throughout the unit. His name was Dean Bolton, and he was the Dean of Students at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He stopped me and said, "Kevin, I need to teach you a valuable lesson in leadership. Crazy people will only make you crazy only if you let them." You know, once you become a part of the chaos, you become a part of the problem. Leaders rise above the chaos so that they can separate the facts from the emotion and lead people to the other side. You know, his words still ring true for me today. When you start contributing to the chaos or get caught up in it, that is when you lose your effectiveness as a leader. And meeting the challenges of today's complex healthcare environment requires having leaders at the helm who can bring order and direction in the midst of chaos. Another lesson I've learned in my career is that as a leader, you need to protect your team's resilience and provide them with the resources and support they need to persevere through a crisis. And this is particularly the case when it comes to an extended crisis. You know, early on in the COVID pandemic, I started having concerns about our staff's stress levels and the impact that the pandemic was having on everyone. It was challenging to even our most seasoned team members as businesses and schools started to close. Parents and caregivers were having to figure out how to navigate homeschooling and childcare. Some had partners and spouses who lost their jobs when businesses shut down. And during the early stages of the pandemic, there was a heightened sense of fear. People were afraid of the possibility of taking COVID home and making their loved ones sick. And remember, very little was known about the transmission modes at that time. And it reminded me of the same types of emotions we experienced as providers in the 80s at the start of the AIDS epidemic. So I knew that we needed to support our team, and so this became a standing topic of discussion at our regular leadership roundtables. We tapped our internal experts and developed interventions to help our employees navigate the many challenges they were facing. Our Office of Wellbeing developed a one-stop website where staff could find help for everything from sleeplessness to depression to support for their child and elder care. We had virtual town hall meetings where we partnered with our infectious disease experts to share what we knew about COVID and how our staff could protect themselves and their loved ones from getting sick. We also started a fund based on a gift from a grateful donor. It allowed us to provide financial support to ensure our most vulnerable employees had food for their families and laptops so their children could learn from home. We also partnered to create food pantries at each of our entities for our employees. And one of our leaders was granted funding so that we could feed the most vulnerable families in our communities. As issues of social justice came into the forefront of our nation and our world, we developed additional resources to support our physicians and staff from underrepresented minority groups. We also held town hall meetings in which we had candid conversations in concert with staff. We spoke openly about how we could create real, lasting change together. We also provided manager training to support facilitation of effective discussions about social justice. So all of these things have been going on over the last 20 months. And please keep in mind that while we had to cancel elective procedures and limit visitation to our families, our doors were very much remained open. We were committed to continuing to care for the people who needed us, educate our learners, and further the research that will allow us to continue to care for our world for generations to come. So you can only imagine the many challenges faced from a leadership perspective. As the president of a health system, I am responsible for a 6-hospital system. 4 of our hospitals are located in Maryland. 1 is located in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and we have a children's hospital that's located in Florida. And as we know, COVID response differs between states and even between regions within each state. I've also chaired the Johns Hopkins Community Physicians, which has more than 40 primary care and specialty care outpatient sites throughout Maryland and the Washington, D.C. area. In my role as Vice President of Johns Hopkins Medicine, I serve in a leadership capacity for the School of Medicine, which is part of the Johns Hopkins University. So my focus is on the intersection of patient care, research, and education. And each of these areas have been impacted by the pandemic. Which brings me to my 3rd lesson. And it centers on resilience and how leaders have to learn to build personal resilience. I've heard someone compare resilience to a rubber band, because like a rubber band that has become stretched out, we all need to learn and understand that we don't always bounce back the way we would hope to. That's why I encourage you to take care of yourselves and learn what to do when you start feeling yourself get a little crispy around the edges. I'd like to share something with you I learned from a friend and former women's basketball coach back at Duke University. While encouraging the athletes that she coached, she would always say, "There will be times during the game when you will lose your footing. No matter how exceptional of an athlete you are, at some point you are going to fall. And I want you to be prepared. So I'm going to teach you how to fall well." And so she would teach her players what to do when they felt themselves going down so that they could prevent themselves from being injured. And I say that because at some point, all people struggle. But it is up to each of us to learn to recognize when we need additional support and resources so that we can get the help we need. There's no shame in losing your footing, but throughout our lives, we should all seek to learn to fall well and be resilient. The last 20 months have been challenging for everyone, and there's absolutely no shame in asking for help in any area of your life. And we need to move away from any stigmas related to doing so. As healthcare leaders, the work that we're doing now is integral to our pandemic response today and to our ability to learn from this moment how we can better address future pandemics, because this will not be our last one. And it is our responsibility to hand our lessons learned and our data off to future generations so that they can build upon the work we've been doing right here, right now, this very moment. And I appreciate having an opportunity to share these lessons that I've personally learned here with you today. I wish good health to you and your loved ones, and I wish you much success in the future. Thank you.
Kevin Sowers, for those brilliant lessons. I think it's all incumbent upon us to learn how to cultivate peace and calm while standing in the midst of ambiguity, and then figure out how to fall well. I appreciated those lessons because I think in a way we all just had to figure it out, right? We had to step up to the plate and hit a home run. We don't have a lot of time, and I want to make sure that we get in a few questions to our panelists. So Kendall, I'll start with you. How did you deal with pushback from providers, patients, community members as COVID became more politicized as the pandemic progressed?
Thanks so much for that question. So I primarily engaged with our physicians, but we were very adamant that we wanted to participate in being a part of the conversation. So we reached out to a lot of the local news media and the international news media, and we put our docs on camera. And they would ask us, how well do you want us to script? Can we practice what I should say? And we told them to go out and be honest. Tell the community what your experience has been. Tell them what is concerning you. Tell them what you're seeing on the floors. So I think that we took the approach of going out and being very authentic. And I think that was one of the ways that we were able to address that.
Thank you. Thank you. Hillary, I think this is a great space for you to share with us. What are some of the key skills needed to guide leadership into the new areas driven by the pandemic? And if we open that more globally to some of the opportunities you see as it pertains to transformational inclusion?
Absolutely. And thank you, Brittany. I would say that it is key to build trust with leaders because once you've built that trust, they really listen to you and they really take feedback and things that you would share and that you would recommend to heart. And that's going to be one of the key drivers as we move forward in this space and this new world that we'll be living in, I think, is trust. But also, I would say the ability to have a high level of emotional intelligence is something that is key as well. So you're able to kind of navigate what's fact, what's fiction, and be able to go forward in that way.
Excellent. Excellent. And I know a lot of us experience a shift in our leadership style. So Christopher, I would appreciate from you and the audience would, how did the pandemic alter the way that you lead in the HIT space?
That's a really good question. I think in a couple of different ways, our leadership style changed. First and foremost, I think we had to really start to shift the paradigm around, that face-to-face type of communication with our staff, that in-person communication, to moving to one that was very much more virtual in nature. And creating collaboration tools that allowed us to continue to communicate with our teams, lead them through not only the crisis, but to manage our day-to-day business, and also be there as a resource for them as they deal with the anxieties associated with what's happening with the pandemic. I think also, we became to some degree, really counselors and support mechanisms for our staff as well too. Those who may have contracted COVID or their family members that may have contracted it, and unfortunately in some cases who may have succumbed to it, we've had to be those resources that they could reach out to for support and guidance and reassurance that although we're going through a very difficult time, we're here to support you through those efforts. And we are here as a collective family of people who recognize the impact that it's had on them, and we're there to support them, whether it's through their job, through supporting their family needs, being more flexible in the job, especially for those who may have young kids who now are staying at home from school. Just being more open and more willing to work with our people really where they are right now.
Excellent. Thank you. And I know a lot of our roles put us in a position to influence the strategic plans of our organization. So with that, Hillary, I'd love to hear from you. One thing in 30 seconds or less, what would you say that our organizations need to do in current state to evolve?
Wow. Okay, so you asked that right when I am dead in the middle of working on our 2022 strategic plan. So I would say that one thing in 30 seconds or less is the ability to be flexible while maintaining that strong core strategy that you have, because Louisiana is huge, right? But not every part of Louisiana is the same. And so you can build a strategy, but there does need to be a little flexibility baked into that so that it actually works for people that it's designed to work for.
Kendall, 30 seconds or less. What do our organizations need in order in this season to evolve?
I think that we need leaders to come to the table as they are. I think about Black leaders having a very different perspective in a space that has not reflected us. And I think the pandemic really showed that the veil was ripped off. You can't be a caricature of yourself during the times of crisis. And so I think organizations need to not only hire leaders of diverse backgrounds, but also give them the voice and the space and the confidence to be able to share their true perspectives.
Excellent. Christopher, take us home.
Sure.
What do our organizations need to evolve?
I think cultivating a culture of innovation, and not only just technology innovation, but overall innovation. How do we think about doing business differently than we've done in the past? What is our new norm now? We'll never be the same as we were before, the latter part of 2019 when this thing started to emerge. So how do we start looking at a new paradigm and operating in that new paradigm so that we can be successful, and encouraging our staff and resources to think outside of the box? We no longer continue to do business the way that we've done it in the past, and we no longer need to continue to do that. Even when we get past the pandemic, we should always be looking for very innovative ways to provide better care to our patients, and improve our operations, and increase employee morale, and enhance diversity and inclusion within our healthcare systems and in our businesses as well.
Thank you. We have had the opportunity to learn so much today from our esteemed panelists. We learned that we need to cultivate a space of peace and calm while operating in the space of ambiguity. We learned that we needed to review, repeat, and then reinforce. Hillary shared with us that daring leadership requires vulnerability. And then Mr. Kendall took us home with, we are who we've been waiting for. And with that, my NACI colleagues, I just want to encourage you that this time, as I say, it has built our muscles. We have a really powerful platform right now to do great work. So with all of the information that we have garnered from our panelists, I encourage you to do great work. With that, I'll hand it back over to Dana and Brian for the remainder of our Congress.
Wow. 2 great sessions today to wrap up this year's conference. Congratulations to all of this year's award winners. And before we wrap up, we want to say thank you to our subcommittee co-chairs for their hard work. It's really not easy to plan a virtual conference 2 years in a row.
It sure isn't. I also want to thank all of our sponsors. The decision of each of our sponsoring organizations to continue to support NACI during this pandemic allows us to create programming like what we've all enjoyed over the last 2 days.
We also want to thank each of you for joining us. We know that we've all had our fill of virtual experiences and we're all ready to get back to in-person events. But your presence has made this a success, and we plan to be back in person next year. So we look forward to seeing you all in October of 2022 in beautiful New Orleans, Louisiana.
Brian and I have been honored to serve as your conference co-chairs for the last 2 years. It was a privilege to see the strength and resiliency of our NACI members and our beloved organization from a front row seat. We encourage each of you to continue to support NACI, to stay engaged and involved, and to please take care of yourselves and one another. We'll see you next year.
Thank you.